President Putin not backing down, in fact, being more aggressive. Let's go now to Clarissa Ward, who is in Ukraine for us in Kyiv. Obviously, this speech was had, and I'm sure it was being watched by the leadership there in Ukraine. What are you hearing from them?
Sarah, we've only heard reaction from one senior advisor to the presidency, Mikhailo Podolyak, but I'm sure it reflects the general thinking and the leadership here. He said, quote, Putin demonstrated irrelevance and confusion because everywhere there are Nazis, Martians, and conspiracy theories, really referring there to this kind of alternate reality that Putin appears to be presenting. He accused the Ukrainian government of being responsible for destroying the economy, destroying the lives of its citizens. He accused them of being responsible for starting the war. He accused them of paying more attention to the interests of the West than to the interests of their own Ukrainian people, really reflecting a sort of startling take on the actual events that we have seen transpire on the ground in the last year. He said, quote, talking about the Ukrainian government again, they unleashed the war and we continue to use force to stop it. This kind of thinking, this sort of alternative reality, I think really underscores why it is that the Ukrainian government has shown such reluctance to really sit down at the negotiating table with Vladimir Putin or with his emissaries and try to hash out some kind of a political situation. Because at this stage, it's clear that there's such a discrepancy in understanding and perspective on the war, and there's such a complete lack of respect for truth and for facts that the Ukrainians just don't believe there's any prospect of being able to take Russia at its word, even if it were to offer a more conciliatory approach. So while you won't see most people here on the ground focusing too much on Putin's speech today, I do think it's fair to say that the leadership will be offering as that this is classic evidence for why a political solution is just not feasible at the moment.
And that is the problem with lies. Clarissa, thank you so much. When you hear stuff like that from Putin, you can see why the Ukrainians say, he's not dealing in reality. We're not going to deal with him.
And we can't go to the negotiating table. There is no negotiation to have. Caitlin.
Yeah, it was quite a lengthy speech there from Putin. The White House, we should note, said President Biden likely was not watching it, but he will be updated on it. So for more on this, let's bring in CNN political and national security analyst David Sanger, who is also the White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times. David, so good to have you here in Poland with us. You were listening to Putin's speech, as I was, and you heard him say that they are suspending participation in that nuclear arms treaty. What does that say to you?
Well, first, Caitlin, what a remarkable 2 days to have the president in Kyiv yesterday, here today, and to hear Vladimir Putin a year into this with a narrative that still is living in sort of his own head here. I mean, as Jake Sullivan, the president's national security advisor, put it to us earlier today, if the Russians pulled out of the war today, the war would stop. If the Ukrainians pulled out of the war today, Ukraine would just be absorbed into Russia.
Pushing back on what Putin has said, that this is because of the West, that
That's
this war is
right.
underway.
That somehow the West, was threatening them. And New START fits into this. So New START is the last remaining treaty arms control treaty between the United States and Russia. It covers the biggest weapons, the strategic weapons that go on ICBMs and that could hit the United States or other countries, or that could hit Russia. And under that treaty, both sides are supposed to be able to inspect the other to make sure that they are complying with the number of warheads that they can have, the deployment of strategic missiles, and so forth. Those inspections haven't happened in the past few years, first because of COVID, and then because the Russians would not allow the inspectors back in. What he has done now is said, I'm done with participating in this inspection thing. What he didn't say was that he's going to build more weapons beyond the 1,550 that are allowed. Now, the whole treaty expires in early 2026. And one of the big questions is this a Vladimir Putin who's even interested in having a follow-on treaty?
That's a worthwhile question.
David, you wrote last night that these vastly different worldviews that we're seeing on the world stage today between what Putin just said and what the president will say shows, quote, echoes of exactly what President Biden wanted to avoid, a replay of the worst days of the Cold War. The difference, though, of course, is the China factor, right?
Look at this one. That's right, Poppy. The China factor is a big element to this because in the Cold War, it was basically between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now we have a much larger third player, and that makes this a lot more complicated. It's also a player on whom we are dependent for technology, for a lot of trade. We were never in the Cold War dependent on the Soviet Union for key technologies. Every Apple iPhone that you pick up is made, or just about every one, is made in China. Think about that. Almost everything you see at Walmart, or much of what you see, is made in China. So this is a much more complicated dynamic. And that's why it's particularly important, Poppy, that we're seeing the top foreign affairs official in China in Moscow today, meeting, we think, with President Putin, certainly with other Russian officials, while the president is here giving his speech.
Well, Sarah, it was notable that just yesterday, President Zelensky told a German newspaper, essentially, if China does provide lethal aid to Russia, we're going to have a world war.
Right. And that is what has been the big concern here, because we're talking about nuclear powers now and world war. I do want to ask you, David, you talked about the importance of China. You talked about, where Russia stands and how we are all connected, whether we like it or not. I am wondering about what you think the possibilities are for Ukraine, assuming, let's say, that Ukraine ends up keeping its territory. Can they join the EU? Will they be given a position, for example, in NATO? Do you think that that is a possibility after all that has happened now in this scenario?
Well, there's a big argument, Sarah, about whether this would be a wise time to let Ukraine into NATO or not. Now, think about this. Ukraine is at war. If it became a member of NATO tomorrow, NATO would be obliged to enter that war directly. So far, it's been indirect. The United States, NATO countries have been providing arms, they've been providing intelligence, but they haven't been providing actual human forces. And President Biden has made it pretty clear that while he wants to support Ukraine, he does not want to risk World War III, as he puts it to his staff, and that means no direct conflict with the Russians. That would end if they entered NATO. Entering the EU would be a different thing, and you could make an argument that if you really wanted to support the rebuilding of Ukraine, you would bring them into the EU right away.